I actually would probably be totally absorbed in John's talk, and the hot air that will generate will be very comforting. So in anticipation, thank you for that, John. So this is the last seminar of the term, as is obvious, and there will be a normal drinks reception afterwards, but then those of us who are members of Space, which is of course most of the, there's also a Christmas party to go to. So it's a little bit of a social as well as an intellectual event, especially as John is presenting. I'm sure everybody knows lots about John, but here are two bits of information, two sentences. Namely, that his main areas of research are in nationalism, ethnicity, racism, and migration. No surprises there. And he's interested in the ways in which ordinary people reproduce ethnic, national, and racialized forms of collective belonging in their everyday lives. His research to date has examined these issues around questions of nationalism and migration in Hungary, Romania, and the UK. And the talk that he's doing today is based on a recently completed ESRC project, which very much pursues the interests that I've just mentioned, mainly on everyday integration, and I believe focused Bristol. And there are various other people from the school involved in the project as well. But I'll let you, John, tell us about the project and allow you to get on with it.
Just to question, did you choose that jumper to match Rose's hair? Striking from here. So hi everyone who's not here.
Today gone tomorrow.
Good. All right. Well, that's my joke for the night. So yeah, thanks Tariq for inviting me or for coercing me into giving this talk. As Tariq said, this is about this everyday integration project that Therese, where's Therese? Raise your hand, Therese. Therese, Bridget, David Manley in geography, Natalie Hyacinth, some of you know. Well, let me just show you the slide here. I'll move slides. There we go. Good. All right, that worked. Good. So Natalie Hyacinth, Ying Wang, Rebecca, I don't think Rebecca's here tonight, and then Nadia Hoff was involved with this last year as well. So, and then 38 community partners from across Bristol, representing different organizations, different interests, different neighborhoods, things like that. Bristol City Council and the Mayor's Office. So 2.5-year project that ended, never ended, but sort of ended officially in terms of the money dried up in March of this past year of 2022. And then we launched our Bristol Integration Framework in July. Project, as it says here, sort of two things. That it began with a kind of researching the everyday contexts, practices, and mobilities of integration in Bristol. So kind of bottom-up approach to thinking about integration in Bristol. And we did that collaboratively with our partners, but that gave us then an evidence base which we used to co-produce or tapped into. We didn't use it fully, but we tried to use that kind of co-produce this Bristol integration framework that I just mentioned, which is a bottom-up, local, and inclusive approach to integration in and for Bristol. So that was launched in July, and we're kind of following up with that now and stuff with some other plans. So that was the project, and that's what I want to talk about today. So what I want to give today, I mean, a cold, dark December evening, end of term, I just want to go home, which is probably how most of you feel as well. But and then to make matters worse, I'm going to give you this like very kind of conceptual talk. So we have all this really good data thanks to Natalie Hyacinth on the project. We have really interesting findings, but we barely scratched the surface of it. So we're just way behind on everything. So this is a paper Natalie and I began writing ages ago. I mean, it was envisioned as a kind of, before we get to the data, we'll kind of work through some of the initial ideas and try to elaborate our approach to integration, which, was formed in part through conversations with our partners and things, and some of the early findings from the research, but it was an earlier paper, and then it just kind of dragged on like everything, COVID, all that kind of stuff, the story. And so this is what we're left with, kind of, at the end of the project now. And this is the kind of approach that we take to everyday integration. So I don't even have pictures, I don't have, animations or anything like that, no emojis, just text and a couple of graphs. So I apologize in advance for that. So anyhow, integration. Why are we talking about integration? I mean, I guess integration, if you think about it, or if you don't think about it, actually, don't think too hard about it, but if you just sort of, if it pops into your mind, we're thinking about integration as a good thing, right? Or it should be a good thing. I mean, policymakers don't pursue disintegration, they don't pursue segregation, well, and historically they do, but they don't pursue these sorts of things. They don't pursue anomie from a kind of Durkheimian perspective. They pursue integration, right? And they're doing that because they think it's a kind of good thing. And that kind of harkens back to, as I said a moment ago, Durkheim and this sort of normative functionalist heritage. Adrian Favell has written on this, on how our understandings, of course, Durkheim didn't talk about immigration, but he talked about integration. And Favell tells us how our understandings of integration are still rooted in that kind of normative functional thinking, that society functions at its best when it's integrated, when people come together and when mutual interdependence kind of creates a kind of organic solidarity or something like that. So those notions still undergird our understandings of integration today. It's just been updated to focus on questions mostly of immigration, not only, but mostly about questions of newcomers to society. And so it takes people it sees as unintegrated, so usually immigrants, and then it tries to integrate them into a nationally defined society, right? So, it makes sense. We're aware of those sorts of things and we don't think too hard about it. Sounds like, okay, that seems like a reasonably decent thing to do. The state typically coordinates these sorts of processes by setting out a policy framework and then institutional pathways along which newcomers can make their way into this national society. So national belonging is kind of a ticket to, but also a reward for integration. And so integration, again, is seen kind of as a good thing, or just as the assumption built into it is that this is something we should be thinking about. Tariq thinks about integration, right? It's a good thing, isn't it, Tariq? Or should be a good thing, right? Yet so many academics, and not a few policymakers as well, are very critical of integration. They have lots of problems with integration. It's the subject of critique, derision, all sorts of things, all sorts of criticism of integration come into play. And so the question is, why is that the case? So what's wrong with integration? You get all these criticisms of it. Critics will point out that the state doesn't only execute its duties with benevolence, but also sometimes with coercion as well, particularly historically when we look at more assimilationist tendencies in integration. So it can be a bit heavy-handed. The state can be heavy-handed. This kind of promise of shared national identity often remains elusive for newcomers who get racialized or essentialized as outsiders. So without a national ticket, there isn't always a national reward. And the divisions that integration wants to overcome sometimes get laid bare and even hardened by integration. So integration, which wants to overcome divisions, ends up reproducing some divisions as well. So those critiques are our starting point for everyday integration. That's kind of where I think all of us who are involved in the project look at integration and think, yeah, that's a problem, right? It's causing problems. It's conceptually has issues. It's creating real world problems as well. And so that was our starting point for this project as well. And we agree that in some respects, integration does more harm than good. But this has led some people to abandon the notion of integration, at least academics, to say, okay, we just need to move on from this. Favell is one of those people. Schinkel, who gave Wilhelm Schinkel, who gave a talk here a few weeks ago, had a similar kind of position. Actually a much more elaborate position than Favell on this. And, people like, I don't know, Anna Korteweg, Janine de Hinden in Switzerland, lots of people have been critical of these sorts of ideas about integration and said we need to move on from this because of its problems. Our view has been to think, well, okay, if you've cataloged these problems so extensively, if we know what the problems are, then surely we can at least try to fix those problems. So rather than abandon integration, our aim is to try to reclaim it, to redefine it and recondition it to address the ongoing social problems that get in the way of integration in the first place. So getting rid of integration isn't going to fix those problems that integration is trying to address. Rather, it ignores them and also risks sidelining academics from policy debates And so if we wash our hands of integration or just swap it for like a cognate concept, we can do this as well. People, I mean, we spent most of the 2.5 years, as Therese will attest to, talking about why are we talking about integration? Why aren't we talking about inclusion or cohesion or something like that? We could talk about adaptation, acceptance, accommodation, incorporation, absorption, acculturation. We could talk about lots and lots and lots of different things, but we have chose integration because if we talk about integration, then we are addressing the pathologies of integration as well, which is one of the aims of the project. So with a little help from our friends, the critics of integration, we also begin with integration's core problems, but then drawing on insights from some other friends, we develop and propose fixes to those problems. So this all begins, and this is my talk in brief, and then after this comes the talk in the long version, so you can leave after the first part if you're interested. So we begin with a redefinition of the integration. What's that?
He admitted, sorry, John.
I don't have control over that.
Yeah, Johan's letting people in.
Yeah. Well done, Johan.
Sorry.
Yeah, so we begin by redefining the problem that integration is trying to address. If you look at convention, so I'm going to do some things that Tariq is not going to like me for. I'm going to just really caricaturize approaches to integration, lump them all together, and make some broad reductionist assumptions about the problems with integration. So this is a foil for what I want to do. Okay, so you know, it's not a comprehensive or nuanced critique of integration, but it's one that allows me to come in and say, you know, this is how we're going to do things differently. So if we look at conventional approaches to integration, the problem that integration is trying to fix is a problem of difference. And because it's immigrant difference, or people, newcomers who are from outside of a national society, then we're talking about national difference to that problem. So for reasons that I'll explain or elaborate on in the body of the talk, that causes division or can be exclusionary. So we think instead about redefining the problem that integration wants to fix, not as national difference, but as social distance. So structural barriers to integration, as opposed to this kind of identitarian logic of national difference. So that redefinition of the integration problem, the problem that we're trying to address with this, or the issue and problem, you know, trying not to use deficit kind of talk, but the issue, the challenge, whatever we're trying to address here, allows us to develop a different approach to integration. So if the integration problem in conventional approaches on the left hand of the screen is national difference, then the fix for that problem is to make people similar, right? So, or to allow people to become similar, make people similar, that's assimilationist, allow them to help them become similar, that's more integrationist. So immigrants need to become similar to a national and then for reasons I'll elaborate on later, that can be divisive given the nature of this kind of ethno-national thinking about integration. Against this, we can develop an approach following from social distance that involves everyone in integration. So that's all of us, right? That's not just immigrants or newcomers or ethnic minorities or even deprived communities or something like that. It's everyone is involved in questions of social distance for reasons again I'll elaborate, but basically just that social distance is not specific to one. Obviously, different people have different experiences of social distance, but it's not something specific to one particular group in society. It's something that involves all of us. So this is really important. This gets us away from this kind of divisiveness of integration. And if you could see behind here, it would say inclusive. That's Janet Orchard in the way. Thanks, Janet. Hold on a second. Yeah, okay, so that's the one, that's the one, I was kidding, Janet. That's the one thing that we're doing that's different. Another thing about the national approach to, or the defining the problem as national difference. When we're talking about national scales, we're very often, not always, talking about states. And so this is, definitely a qualified answer because there is an increasing move to local approaches to integration. But historically, traditionally, states have been seen as the fixer of these problems, and that can lead to prescriptive top-down approaches to integration, where the state says, do this, don't do that. And we have different sorts of examples of those things. From the everyday integration approach, we begin with this idea that people, you and I, do the work of integration, which the everyday sort of practices which constitute the building blocks of integration. So it's a bottom-up approach. It starts with a surplus logic instead of a deficit logic. So it's not that there's a problem here that needs to be fixed. It's that we're getting along just fine with, integration, doing whatever the kind of these mundane practices of integration. But there are things that get in the way of that, structural problems, social distance, that cause social distance. And those are the things that need fixing, not the people. So it's not focused on the people in that sort of sense. And then the third thing is that integration occurs into the nation state from a kind of national difference perspective. So this is people from outside coming inside. And this can lead to national and even nationalist approaches to integration. For us, integration doesn't occur in a place, but begins at the local and then connects to other scales via the local. So if we see integration in this bottom-up way, that people do the work of integration in their everyday lives, then it makes sense to focus on their everyday lives in local context, which doesn't mean they're not connected beyond local context. It just means it's a nice, convenient starting point to think about that. So again, it's now Janet and Melanie who are causing the problems here, but so inclusive, bottom up, and local. Don't worry about it, it's fine, it's fine. Yeah.
Just minimize that column of, people.
We do that?
Yeah.
All right. Bye, everyone.
There you
go. Okay, good. So inclusive, bottom up, and local. And that's the talk. That's the short version. So really, I mean, you can go if you want. But I'm going to now elaborate on that a little bit more fully for the rest of the talk. So redefining the integration problem, an inclusive approach, bottom up approach, and local approach. So no pictures, nothing interesting like that. So let's start with redefining the integration problem. And again, the logic here is that conventional approaches to integration begin by dividing the world into two groups, people who are integrated and people who are not integrated. And those who are not integrated are classed as different in some sense. The kind of difference that integration is preoccupied with is immigrant difference, which people like Schinkel would point out that it doesn't really dissolve over time, but rather kind of evolves into a kind of ethnic difference, or ossifies into a kind of ethnic difference. So the immigrant generation becomes an ethnic minority after that. Integration's fixation with immigrant difference means that the self against which immigrants are understood is a national self. So we're looking at national outsiders so that we understand ourselves implicitly. We don't think a lot about ourselves in questions of integration, but if we do, we are understood as a national self. So if the immigrant, if the integration problem is immigrant difference, then the fix to that problem is going to be national similarity. So making people similar in some sort of way. The problem, as I was saying, with these sorts of approaches that begin with difference is that they very often end up hardening the difference that they purport to want to overcome. And this is because, in part, the insight which immigrants must aspire is this national insight, right? So even when that national insight is defined by Tariq in a more civic and inviting and inclusive terms and all those sorts of things, or accommodating terms and that kind of stuff, we still have this kind of essentializing and sometimes even racializing logic of nationalism that's informing that, the kind of ideas of the nation that are informing that. So if we think about the names we give to the inside, we're talking about the majority, we're talking about natives sometimes. We use languages like that, or even indigenous people. So what's the, I don't know, I can see it, but I can't pronounce it, the Dutch word, the autochtones or something like that, the word, the Dutch, yes, sorry, thank you, good. So we have languages like that, about indigeneity and stuff like that. The name for those who begin their lives on the outside, that's immigrants. And so that's different from that. So newcomers can become many, many different things to a society, but they can't become native to a society that they weren't born in, right? They can't become indigenous to that. And it's those sorts of racializing or essentializing logics that present a formidable barrier to integration, because the thing that we're asking of them is something that's conceptually problematic. Whilst the state likes to affirm its commitment to the mingling and the melding of difference, integration is in fact a mechanism very often for making and marking difference. Becoming nationally similar, the expectation of newcomers can become perpetual, never fully realized. And so national integration is not the organic or the anodyne amalgamation of difference. It is the hard-fought struggle to protect and even purify the racial or national boundaries of the community of value, in the way that Bridget talks about it. Was not here, I don't think so. So our approach sees the integration problem not as national difference, but as social distance. So by social distance, it's a nice way to contrast it to questions of national difference. I mean, I don't want to make too much of this. We're talking about structural barriers to the everyday work of integration. So things like economic problems, unemployment, precarious labor, exploitation, all these sorts of things that leave us with inequalities and social class prejudices that keep people apart in some way. Social ills like racism, discrimination, prejudice, but also fear, insecurity, uncertainty compel some people to hunker down in their own little bubbles, and again, keep us apart in certain ways. Legal constraints like no recourse to public funds, things like this can make it difficult for some people to fully participate in social life or civic life or other things like that. And then geographic distance, of course, can make it difficult for some people, can be exacerbated by inadequate transport links and things like that, and again, makes social distance more of a problem. So these things here, I mean, we can think of many other forms of structural constraints of social distance. We can talk about educational, public health, gendered, and lots of different things. These are the things that we focus on, the economic, social, civic, and spatial in the project. So that's why I've kind of listed them here or drawn attention to them, but we can think of them in many different sorts of respects. So these and other forms of social distance get in the way of that everyday labor of integration. And if you look at these things over here, these problems, or any list of problems that you might call social distance problems, making people nationally similar is not going to fix that set of problems there. Rather, the fix for those problems is to address and attenuate the barriers that keep people apart, that reproduce social distance in the first place. Which isn't to say that our approach, so this is a conversation Therese and I've had many times, this isn't a social capital approach. This isn't about pushing people together. This isn't about bridging links and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's fine. People want to do that. But our approach is about lessening the barriers so that people can come together on their own volition as and when they want to. So it's not about saying, if these people, if group A comes together with group B, then we have integration. No, it's just that we should reduce the barriers to the things that allow people to come together for whatever reason they want to come together. So the advantage of starting with social distance as the integration problem is that it makes it possible for us to conceive of integration as inclusive, bottom-up, and local. Our approach can be inclusive because social distance impacts all of us. So it might do that in different ways, or it does do that in different ways. But those experiences of social difference are not defined or confined by an immigrant native binary. So we're not stuck in this kind of self, other, us, them binary from the beginning. So they involve everyone. Our approach can be bottom up because it begins with a recognition that we're already doing the work of integration in the routine practices and mobilities of our everyday lives. Top-down approaches begin, as I said, with this kind of deficit logic that there are people who are unintegrated or insufficiently integrated and they have to be integrated. But a bottom-up approach begins with a surplus logic that people do the work of integration, but certain things get in the way of that work. The problem is not with the people, but with the things that get in the way and that produce and reproduce social distance. And finally, our approach can become local because integration begins, although it doesn't end, at the local level. So again, national approaches expect, but then also provide this barrier I was talking about, expect integration to occur into the nation. Local integration isn't integration into the local, but integration that begins at the local and then connects to multiple other scales of experience beyond that. So redefining the integration problem as social distance opens the door to developing this kind of approach that we want to take. And now I will elaborate on that. So beginning with, again, this problem with conventional approaches to integration. So many of these approaches position people who are unintegrated outside of this imagined community of the nation. Integration is supposed to remedy this problem, and becoming similar or becoming national is the pathway for overcoming that difference. Back in the day, the state tried to make immigrants national through assimilationist policies. And then integration emerges later as a kind of corrective to those more coercive tendencies, and becoming similar gets recalibrated as a kind of more of a meeting in the middle. So integration, however, doesn't make people similar, it makes them different. This is Shinko's point again, reinforcing and hardening the difference which it says it wants to overcome. So integration that is premised on difference ends up reproducing difference, and not just any difference, but this kind of essentialized or racialized national difference. It also has the effect of placing the burden of responsibility for integration on immigrants, and it's divisive in this way as well. The majority, us, well not us, not me, you, the majority is the unmarked category against which the marked category of migrants is made visible. So the majority can choose to get involved, it can lend a helping hand, it can trip you up if it's so inclined, and seems to be inclined very often to do that sort of thing. But it can also just sit back and not get involved, opt out of it. It has no requirement to opt in. Their role is a kind of opt-in. But the people who are different, the immigrants, the unintegrated, they don't have the choice to opt out of this. They have a responsibility always to integrate. So we got our two-way street metaphors here, but the traffic is flowing in one direction, with the state supplying the road, the signage, and the policing, but immigrants doing all the travel. So it's immigrants, when we talk about integration, who should forge interethnic ties, right? I mean, you're welcome to, you can have your interethnic friend. I'm an immigrant, you can be friends with me, right? And say, you have an immigrant friend. So you can do that kind of thing, but you don't have to, but immigrants do have to do those things. It's immigrants who should cultivate a sense of belonging to their new home, and belonging is pre-given for the majority, right? It's for you. And it's immigrants who do the labor of integration, where the majority is just a kind of bystander. So it's immigrants who are expected to undertake this journey, and one that doesn't end at a national terminus, but rather strands them as ethnic minorities. So immigrants are also categorized to a bewildering array of statuses and measures that identify, exceptionalize, and problematize them as unintegrated, again, adding to that kind of difference-making or stigmatization. So those being measured are very often not quite good enough. Their integration is just a little bit out of reach or something, not quite there. And all these measures are used to highlight integration deficiencies or integration deficits. And then the classifications they provide, things like unintegrated or insufficiently integrated, all these sorts of things provide this convenient evidence of deficiencies that can then be used for further interventions or integration interventions or measures to pursue that integration further. So unintegrated immigrants are then aggregated into ethnic groups, as I was saying, and then in a circular logic, ethnicity gets put forward as the variable that explains their lack of integration. So it's both kind of cause and effect of the lack of integration. Against all of this, we urge a fundamental rethink of integration that sheds its divisive association with immigration and recalibrates it as an inclusive approach involving everyone. So we're not the first here to recognize integration's exclusionary logic. So what I was talking about builds on other critiques of integration. So those have been around for a while, people like Shinko, like Ritter, people that I've been talking about. And we're also not the first to kind of look into or to try to develop fixes to these sorts of problems. So I mentioned Anna Porteveg's work earlier. She develops a social justice approach that shifts the focus from cultural difference to economic inequality, which is, I think, an important step in terms of getting beyond that kind of differentialist logic of integration. Others adjust and expand integration's aperture to take in more diverse understandings of diversity, so super diversity and intersectionality and those sorts of things, which again are improvements. Others have really kind of focused on non-ethnic pathways to incorporation explicitly. Something here, the work of Lick Schiller and Aisha Chalar, Louise Ryan, all these people talk about, I can't remember who says what, but one of them talks about emplacement or embedding and these kinds of processes but they're not focusing on the kind of ethnic dimensions of that, but on sort of what they refer to, or at least Wickschiller and Chawler as non-ethnic pathways to incorporation. And then there's the microanalytical stuff that I really like, which is like Ash Amin, a political geographer. We begin with the micro-publics of urban life, where shared purpose is negotiated and constructed through practices of hospitality, sociability, conviviality, those kinds of things. Again, not through a kind of ethnic lens. So these approaches and others like them move beyond integration's groupist and nationalist genealogy to recenter it on the complex and diverse contexts and practices of everyday life. So that's a positive thing, and those are things that we are building on here. But, and you knew there had to be a but, whilst they've taken pains to move beyond ethnicity, most have not dropped their focus on immigration, right? So they're still interested in this question of immigrant integration, which of course is important and interesting, but it means that we're still stuck in this kind of binary of immigrant and non-immigrant. So Schinkel reminds us again that immigrant status is but a stepping stone to ethnic minority status. So if they're focusing on immigrants, they're ultimately still interested in these sorts of questions that become ethnic at some point. We, in contrast, propose a clean break that sees integration as always involving everyone. And so until we fundamentally de-exceptionalize immigration and integration, immigrants will remain the problem population. We need to shed integration, therefore, of its perennial fixation with immigration and with difference more fundamentally. So if we stop thinking of integration as us and them, we're left with us, right? Problem solved. So, which is not to say this is a colorblind approach to integration, but one that rather recognizes the complexity and the diversity of all everyday experience, including that colored by racism, but without predefining experience in terms that preclude or obscure other forms of domination and oppression. So not just sort of focusing on only one axis of domination and oppression. So our approach does not turn a blind eye to immigrants, ethnic minorities, or any other population, but nor does it begin with or exceptionalize any single population. Indeed, we begin not with categories of difference that we feel constrain us, but with the varied practices of everyday life through which we contribute to integration. So it's a practice-based approach to integration, not an identity one. When we begin with difference, we get stuck in this feedback loop of difference, reproducing and hardening it rather than attenuating it. When we begin with social distance, we can develop an approach to integration that involves everyone by lessening that social distance. So it's not individuals and whose values or identities or behaviors need changing. It's rather these everyday institutional, routine, spatial, and temporal barriers to integration that require our attention, which doesn't deny people their agency integration, but rather allows their agency by intervening in the forces of social distance that get in the way of it in the first place. The problems of integration are these structural barriers of social distance that interrupt and complicate integration. Okay, so moving on to the bottom-up approach to integration. So the next feature is of our approach is that we view integration as this ongoing practical accomplishment of people doing routine things in their everyday lives. So integration in this respect doesn't happen by fiat or by dictate because someone says it should happen. It starts from the bottom up where integration is done in these routine practices. So again, it's trying to kind of invert the way we think about integration, flipping these more prescriptive, top-down, nationalist, and sometimes divisive approaches on their head in favor of a more bottom-up agenda that begins by recognizing the labor of integration that people are already doing in their everyday lives. In most cases, in most conventional approaches to integration, the state still plays an important role doing much of the heavy lifting of integration. It's kind of the arbiter and the manager of integration policies, supplying these sorts of national opportunity structures to which would-be nationals are expected to bend. But these policy frameworks don't necessarily give us a roadmap for how integration is going to be experienced on the ground by people. So it doesn't always follow, integration doesn't necessarily follow the preferred pathways laid out by the philosopher and bureaucrat architects of integration. So prescriptive one-size-fits-all policies are poorly equipped to capture the profound, let alone subtle variation that characterizes local circumstances. Unintegrated, and that's because top-down approaches are not in the business of attending to differences, but rather promoting sameness or national sameness. Our approach to integration begins from the bottom up with this nitty-gritty of everyday life and the routines, encounters and exchanges and mobilities, from the superficial and the ephemeral to the repetitive and the institutionalized, which supply these quotidian building blocks for integration. So this isn't about becoming integrated, it's about doing integration, about the practices of integration. It's about when we make new connections or renew old connections, when we lend a helping hand to a neighbor, talk through a predicament with a colleague, or when we chat with parents on the school run, or all these sorts of things are the building blocks of kind of everyday integration. These and other things that we refer to as exchanges, they can be fleeting, superficial, even nonverbal, an offhand remark, a kind of a quick fire question, even just a friendly nod or something like that. But they can also be regularized and institutionalized. So friendships that get informed by diverse histories, or scripted conversations with call centers, or meetings that follow established routines, ethnicity center seminars, these sorts of things. Although I'm doing all the talking so far, you'll get your chance. So this idea of exchange is important to us because it conveys this idea of reciprocity that is sometimes simultaneous, is sometimes banked for the future, and sometimes not always cashed in. But at least it has this potential to invest us in further exchange, establishing more durable conduits for future exchange and in placing or embedding, as Louise Ryan says, in diverse social relations of everyday life. So everyday exchange involves all of us, not as immigrant and native, but as friend and neighbor, as colleague and classmate, as customer and shop assistant, and all these other sort of relational categories that define much everyday experience. So beginning with exchange compels us to see integration as an ongoing and uneven process, a negotiation that gets improvised and repeated every day. So exchange is a good thing, but of course not all exchange is good. Exchange can involve things like racism and hatred, and it can be contentious or agonistic, it can be debate, it can be conflict, all these kinds of things. All exchange, of course, is situated in complex social structures which condition its possibilities. So we shouldn't be overly optimistic about any sort of emancipatory potential of exchange. The often invisible and sometimes invidious structures that shape, distort, and disrupt exchange cannot be ignored, but that's kind of the point, is to kind of draw attention to those things that are disrupting exchange. People are agents of integration, but there are these structural problems that get in the way of it. And so for everyday integration to contribute, everyday exchange to contribute to integration, we need to more fully understand how it works and the things that get in the way of it. In this venture, we believe that community organizations are well placed to help us understand these sorts of best practices and barriers to integration. So, I mean, people are the focus of what we're interested in here, but community organizations are sort of connected to local communities in ways that they're attuned to what's happening with residents in those communities. So these organizations we think of as curators of local knowledge about how integration works and how it doesn't work, which is not to propose or not to suggest that community organizations, the voluntary sector should become responsible for integration. It's not a kind of neoliberal outsourcing of integration policy to under-resourced community organizations. Rather, what we're proposing is the feeding up of knowledge to local governance structures. So the knowledge that they have about the challenges of integration in local communities should be fed into local governance structures so that bespoke interventions can then be made back in the communities where they're needed and when they're needed, trying to address those barriers to integration. These policy interventions, so I mean, it's obviously a kind of static slide here, but these policy interventions are not, this isn't a kind of model for, an integration fix. What this is meant to represent here is that there should be piecemeal, specific, and ongoing policy interventions, that arrow that kind of points back down there, responding to shifting challenges in across diverse communities. So there isn't a single kind of one-size-fits-all approach to integration, no integration endgame. Rather, integration is an ongoing process that requires this shifting assortment of tweaks and adjustments, maybe sometimes some older schemes designed to attenuate local manifestations of social distance. Integration works when these pathways of knowledge exchange, linking the routine context of everyday life with the institutions of local governance via community organizations are regularized. So when knowledge about best practices and integration barriers flows up and sideways, and when bespoke interventions that facilitate those best practices and attenuate those barriers flow back down to local communities. Okay, so the third bit then is the local approach to integration. Integration into the nation implies a kind of a journey that needs to be made. So this journey isn't for everyone, but it's for those people who are not already in the nation. Integration at the local, in contrast, doesn't involve a journey to integration, but rather a place for integration, a context for integration instead. So rather than beginning at the national and working our way down to the local, our approach is to kind of flip that around and begin at the local and work our way up, well, maybe work our way up to the national if we want to. So national agendas that peddle national solidarities as a cure-all are not up to the task of addressing more immediate local priorities, at least of the sort that we describe here. So we need approaches that deliver services, not identities to local residents. We argue that integration should begin at the local level where these practical challenges of everyday integration are right at our doorstep. So in contrast to the more ideologically driven, identity-based and value-laden approach favored by states, talking about things like fundamental British values and life in the UK test and things like that, local approaches to integration tend to be more pragmatic, innovative, and responsive, and also inclusive. At least that's how they're characterized in the scholarship. So the third feature of our approach then is that integration is local, which is probably the worst kept secret in the scholarship on integration and increasingly policy circles as well. So this is a trend that for some time now and gaining momentum. So we're kind of pushing on an open door here, but one nevertheless that I think is important to keep open. National approaches are criticized for being insufficiently variegated to attend to the richness and complexity of local contexts. The conventional division of labor between state and local governance in questions of integrations has states elaborating policy frameworks for integration, and then local authorities trying to implement those or enact those policy interventions. But that's been shown in multiple contexts across Europe and the UK as well to kind of not operate so smoothly. So national level agendas are sometimes viewed as out of touch with local priorities. They're almost always local priorities are almost always seen as being under-resourced. So there can be frictions, there can be tensions, and sometimes you get local authorities working around or even behind these kinds of national frameworks. So, so against this, what we want to do is look at the micro interactional spaces of local contexts of everyday life that provide a useful starting point for thinking about how routine encounters, practices and exchanges can contribute to integration. So we begin with these locally situated practices, the bottom-up approach that I was talking about, that take place across neighborhoods and streets and interest groups, sports, clubs, school affiliations, all these kinds of things, and rooted in this immediacy of everyday social interaction. Integration doesn't come about through these sorts of lofty rhetoric or vaulted ideals, but via the routine encounters of everyday life. So integration doesn't occur into the nation, it starts at the local. It begins at the local level in the situated practices and spatial contexts of everyday life, and from there it follows the pathways of its individual agents as they intersect multiple social spaces. So the local is defined not by fixed territorial or administrative boundaries, but by the life worlds of its inhabitants and the trajectories that carry them through multiple scales of experience. And finally, local and scalar approaches to integration do not reproduce this division inherent in national integration. So partially because the local is not predefined by ethno-national binaries in the way that national scales are. It doesn't have that same kind of intrinsic attachment to ethnicity, which isn't to say that ethnicity doesn't matter at a local level. Of course it does, but it's not a kind of predefined binary that defines local experience in the way it's connected to national level experience. So multiple forms of exclusion, of course, operate at all levels, but only by beginning locally with everyone can we avoid the kind of this reductionist trap that we have at the national level to work through the variety of specific challenges of exclusion. So we thus begin with this immediacy of the local over the abstraction of the national, and our approach doesn't stop at the local, but again starts from the local and then scales up to other levels, other scales of experience from there. So, conclusion. Our approach to integration is inclusive, local, or bottom-up and local, as I've been saying. And this approach is made possible by redefining the integration problem as social distance and not national difference. The problem is that not some of us are different and need to be made similar, but rather that the problem is that we're obstructed in our everyday work of integration by social distance, and it's social distance that requires our attention, so not the people in the sense that conventional approaches are concerned with. These barriers that we're talking about cannot be addressed by a single grand integration policy, but require this bundle of ongoing interventions, and fine-tunings and adjustments to address the specific requirements of local communities. So our aim is not to design an integration policy, but rather an integration process, a durable institutional framework to identify both the structural barriers to integration and integration best practices, and then to make localized bespoke interventions for addressing those on the ground. So integration, of course, is started by saying it has had a checkered past. It's spent much of its time being part of the problem more than part of the solution. Integration's problems have been cataloged and picked apart by its critics, leaving many to conclude that the best thing we can do with it is just move beyond it, bin it, and do something else. But we have obviously thought that we can fix it in some way. So the social distance problems that the broad package of integration is supposed to address, things that I've been talking about, like insecurity and precarity, exclusion and division, mistrust and apathy, isolation and immobility, those things are not going to go away on their own accord. So whilst we've argued that the fixes to those problems must be local and specific and need not fly under a kind of banner of integration policy, we've also found it prudent to join them up under our rubric of everyday integration so that we might enjoy a seat at the table where discussions of integration are taking place. We could just as easily talk about social inclusion, maybe even social cohesion or something like that. Lots of cognate concepts that overlap with our version of integration. But if we want to have a chance of shaping the future directions of integration, then we need to speak the language of integration to get there. So that's it.
Thank you very much, John. So maybe if you take your share screen off, we can then have the people. Yeah, that's it. We can maximize that.
Yes. How do we do
So
that?
Sharing.
can you see the?
Oh, yeah, sure.
And then you can maximize this. Yeah. Not necessarily Janet, but everybody. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, great. So, and are you comfortable where you are? I mean, that camera can be moved, so you. Exactly, I was going to say, if you want to be more in the middle, that camera can be moved.
No,
If you're happy there, that's great. Yeah, thank you very much. And belated hello to everybody online. You can't see me, but I got a good idea of who you are. This screen. I've actually forgot about your presence till John mentioned it at the start of his talk. Yeah, so people putting their hands up, people got some questions. I saw yours first, Dan, and then yours.
John, that was really interesting. And you know, I broadly agree with everything today. So it is kind of more of a sort of devil's advocate type serious critique. But yeah, I'm just wondering whether, you know, is there a danger of sort of maybe sort of romanticizing the local here? I mean, I'm thinking about, you know, it's difficult to sort of define what the local is. You know, can we really consider, you know, the city to be a local space, for example? Can we really consider those, you know, if we think about the city as a sort of network space with lots of different localities, but also connecting to other scales, you know, is there a problem, first of all, with defining the local, but then is there also a problem? I mean, what's to stop local people thinking and acting like a state? You know, many of us would have had the experience of going into a local pub in a village, and if you embody sort of aspects of difference, being stared at, being, you know, this can happen in a city as well. So yeah, is there perhaps a danger of kind of the local scale being privileged and seen as something which is kind of inherently free from the nation state, when actually, in fact, it can be a site of kind of reproduction of nationalism and racism?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Dan, especially on that last point. For that last point, so just to come to it in a couple of different ways, it is romanticized, and I mean, I think I see it as kind of something that's not the nation, right? So it's convenient as a way to position it against something that is more of an abstraction, an imagined community, or something that, you know, is more intrinsically connected to some of these ideas of nation, ethnicity, and whatnot. It doesn't mean those things don't manifest in the local. It's just, it's not the starting point for thinking about the local. Obviously they do, and we need to be concerned about them as well. But there's also, you know, what I think one of the trends that I recognize in scholarship is, if you look at local approaches to integration, what that very often means is a devolution of integration policy to local authorities. And then you can get these really prescriptive, top-down local approaches to integration, which are just as coercive or just as kind of out of touch with local areas as they are with you know, as national approaches are with local areas. So that doesn't always work. I mean, typically it's shown to be like a more progressive kind of approach to integration, but there's a lot of research in different parts of the world, different parts of Europe especially, where you get like bad local approaches to integration. They've got the authority to kind of approach their own, develop their own approach to integration, and they do it in kind of racist and exclusionary ways like that, so it's not a fix in and of itself. For me, it's important to position it against the problems with national level approaches to integration, which are all those things and also out of touch with what's happening on the ground. So I think it's just more of a kind of, you know, it's just really connected to the bottom-up idea. What we're invested in is the sorts of everyday practices of it. And those have many different scales of experience, but it just intuitively, at least to me, it makes sense to kind of think about that in terms of, you know, what's happening here. And then I don't define the local because I don't know how to define the local. I define it as not national. So again, a kind of residual category. If you try to define it, then I don't know, you just get more constrained by some definition that works in this situation, not others. So yeah, point taken. Thanks.
Thanks. So you're next.
Thanks. That was really interesting. It's a related question actually. So I was thinking about where community groups are situated in your everyday integration model as being a part of the solution, but they're not so much conceptualized in critiques of how integration is not working at the national level. So I wonder, firstly, how you kind of conceptualize community groups in what is already the model of integration, and then how you approach tackling instances where perhaps community groups are imposing social, you know, structures that increase social distance rather than advocating for lessening those structures at a local government level.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Rosa. And just, you know, I mean, I was prepared for the bias in Dan's question that goes to the local and stuff. I think I'm less prepared for the bias that's inherent in thinking about the voluntary sector as just doing good work, you know, all the time, right? So when it wouldn't dare do these things that you're talking about, but you're right, that can happen. So in terms of where we conceptualize it, that's easier before we get into, you know, bad community groups. In terms of where we conceptualize it, it's the kind of, you know, next best approach to bottom up. So we need to have some sort of organization to what we're doing. We need to have some sort of institutional foundation to work with. And so rather than just saying, okay, there's 450,000 people in Bristol, we'll just talk to them and see what's going on. You know, we say, all right, let's start with community organizations. And because they're talking to people, we assume they're talking to people and have their finger on the pulse of local communities. So that's kind of the logic of thinking about community organizations as the bottom-up approach, which is different than the one I described to Dan, which is taking local authorities as a bottom-up approach. I don't think local authorities are a bottom-up approach. I think they're a local approach, which is good. But, you know, even if they're, I mean, you can have local authorities on their own formulate an integration policy. We want to begin with the knowledge that we have in local communities. That's the easy part of the answer to the question. The hard part is, what do you do when they're bad local community or bad community organizations or contributing to social business? So I mean, I do have an answer to that question in terms of where we went with the framework and how we have this idea about constituting kind of coalitions of community organizations to work through specific integration challenges, the sorts of advocacy group type mechanism that we outlined in the framework. So I guess, you know, we would get, it's not for one local authority to go, sorry, one community organization to go to Bristol City Council and say, we need you to do this. I mean, it's not that kind of approach to it. It's about working together through different sorts of challenges that local communities face, which can come from multiple perspectives. So there could be a neighborhood thing that's also an age thing, or a sexuality thing, or an immigration thing, or something like that. So getting the different key stakeholders involved in working through different issues, and then in that process, hopefully there'll be enough good people to sort it out. I don't have an answer to your question. That's my answer. Yeah, figure it out for me, please, and let me know.
I'm next.
This is going to take a while.
What I really appreciate about what you're doing, itself, your project, and the approach, is that you're trying to find, you know, positive solutions that you can feed into thinking and debate and even policy circles about the issues of common concern. So in a way, it's not defeatist when you say, look, we look at the national, or what you call the conventional understanding of integration, look at all the flaws and the pathologies, but here's an alternative way of thinking about integration, where actually we can come away with something positive and worthwhile. So that's great. But you are very defeatist about the national. So, I mean, if you like, I try and fix the solutions at the national level without claiming I've succeeded or whatever, but people like me, insofar as we're concerned with, you know, various kinds of what you called ideologies, I mean, various kinds of normative isms, don't just accept the national, which, as you said, was a foil or a caricature.
Yeah.
But say, well, how can the national be made to work so that it lives up to its promise of equal citizenship and national belonging? But we can leave that aside. I'm not saying you have to do that. I'm just saying that you have one positive element, from my point of view anyway, one positive element, but that positive element follows a certain kind of pessimistic defeatism. The point I really just want to ask you about is, okay, just focusing now on your own approach and leaving aside alternatives, is you seem to, in your problem definition of social distance, so you're very explicit that there are other approaches that are too much focused on identitarian issues, whether it's minority identities or majority identities. In your talk, you mainly talked about the problems of minority identities, but in a way they're interrelational. So yeah. But as far as I could see, you've left out identities altogether in your problem definition, because your problem definition, you know, what is social distance? It's all to do with basically economics, urban infrastructure, resources, and certain kinds of, you know, discriminatory processes, all of which are defined independently of anyone having any identities whatsoever, whether it's minorities, majority, or the city itself, you know. And that seems to me, I think that's an impossible position to begin with, because there clearly are identitarian issues, you know, othering, wanting to belong, whether it's wanting to belong to a minority identity or a national identity, and so on. So I'm not sure how you can come up with a view of integration by leaving identity out altogether, as opposed to just come up with probably what you might call a social democratic perspective focused on the local. And then
How many questions do you have?
one question, because you don't need to discuss the national, except in relation to what Dan said.
You just do this so I can forget my answer.
All right, okay, I'll stop.
Can you just come back then with the fourth
time I'll come back.
On to the third one, because I have an answer to that. So the identity thing, I kind of anticipated that. You're right. I mean, the way that I presented it was like this social, economic, civic, and spatial. But then I also went on to say that that's what we focused on in the project, and there could be other things as well. So you know, I'm concerned about this because obviously racism. I mean, that comes up, and that's an identity question, or not just an identity question, but it can take on identity sort of aspects as well. And you know, and that I guess the bottom-up approach says, look. Not come to us, but let's look at what the challenges that local communities are facing, and then address those challenges in this kind of way that I was explaining to Rosa. You know, bring people together, stakeholder meetings or something like that, to kind of work through different things, and then feed that up into structures of local governance. Those challenges, you know, even the civic, social, economic, and spatial is almost too suggestive. It's not to tell people what those challenges are. It's to say, you know, let's talk about those things. So it's simply there clearly could be identity issues that are part of those challenges. But I guess our approach to that is to think about how people can work through these problems at the local level, and then if they identify those problems as identity issues, and then that's something that they can work through together. I think more fundamentally, the way I think about identity in this kind of integration approach, my problem with the identity thing as a starting point for integration is that it gets us into this kind of us-them kind of thinking about it, just like you were automatically doing when you talk about majorities and the minorities. I know it's two sides of the same point. I mean, yes, so that's kind of gets us into that sort of thing. Identities are important, but I see them as following from practice as rather, I mean, you know, in some sort of chicken egg sort of sense. It's the identities are a reflection of our practices rather than an ingredient to those practices. Obviously, it becomes both at some point. But I see the practices as somehow being more fundamental. So that's why we're developing this practice-based approach. The identities in our project were represented by our 38 different community organizations who were not always identity or interest-based in that sort of sense, but very often were. Even when they were neighborhood ones, they have strong neighborhood identities, right? So that sort of reflects that kind of thing. So again, they bring those identities to the table, and that's something that is part of the discussions that we're having. We're just not privileging one particular configuration of identities to say that this is about newcomers or immigrants or minorities or ethnicity or something like that. All those people are at the table, or potentially at the table, or can be at the table, but so can people with disabilities, people from LGBTQ backgrounds, people from, you know, with Age UK was one of our partners, neighborhood associations, all those kinds of things have different agendas, different interests, different communities that they see themselves as representing, and they should be part of that discussion as well. So there's a mechanism in what we're doing to allow for those identities to be expressed. We're just not starting with that and saying, in fact, we're trying to avoid starting with that, because that's the thing that leads down to, I think the focus on immigrants only is the thing that creates the division. I don't see a way out of that, other than just not to focus on immigrants. So what's your fourth question?
I'll keep that for later. Let's see if anyone on the Zoom would like to ask a question. If so, please use the hand function or use your hand. Yes, go ahead, Janet.
Hi, and sorry about the noise earlier.
Okay.
I'll try to make a
You're
good noise
muted.
now. I mean,
all right, you
my
might be
problem
I
with
think she's muted by everyone. Can you unmute people, please, Yuhan?
can you hear me now?
Is your computer volume at its highest, Janet?
Let me just look.
This is providing a school meeting.
How about that?
You have
Is
a
that
school
better?
meeting? Well, come and fix it then, Therese.
Is that any better?
Yeah, no, we had this, it's not that, you know what it is, it's that the settings are such that they can't, they're all automatically muted. It's not the microphone settings.
Right, and
Is
anyone
that it,
else?
Therese?
They weren't last time.
It's the arrow next to mute, I think.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah, but it's not crossed, so that means it's working.
No.
Oh, look, Jill can hear. So Janet, you can talk to Jill.
I can
arrow
talk to
next
other
to the
people
microphone
on
in the bottom
Zoom.
left,
I
I
can't
think
talk
it's
to
We'll
the
give you
room.
some options, the drop-down menu next to it.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry if
Upper
it's
menu.
too loud and clear.
Select, yeah.
I don't know which one, yeah.
It's
No,
select a speaker.
Select a speaker.
Yeah, I think select a speaker, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Come down to the next. Oops. Yeah.
Say something, Janet?
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Hey, well done, you.
Now your question.
Right, well, I find a question hard because I basically agree with so much of what you've said. And I was interested in the point about the bias, because then that made me think about the bias of policymakers and the very narrow range of experiences from which people who typically create policy, which they draw, and there's kind of often quite, if I'm brutal and think about education, the kind of paternalistic assumptions that people have, because basically they've never spent any time in the kinds of communities that they're making decisions about. So I wondered if those kinds of experiences from a quite sort of a narrower education context, where there's a lot of prejudice against the value of close to practice research and the sort of bottom upness, I think it's about reassessing that. And I really liked what you had to say about the way in which studies like yours help us to understand, give us knowledge, really enrich our understanding of what it's actually like to be in a community, and that where integration is, an issue, and that's really important and needs to inform policy more strongly than it currently does. So I guess cheering on the sidelines, what do you reckon?
Well, keep going, Janet. I like it. Just say more. That's really nice, Janet. Yeah, no, thanks. And that's kind of what we are trying to do. And just, yeah, it's not perfect, but I think that's the same problem that we're recognizing, not just.
Yeah, and the stories are so resonant and important and underrepresented that they need bringing to light and highlighting. So if that's being biased to counter an existing bias,
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with it. I know going into areas of challenging circumstance, euphemistically described like that as a professional from, well, I didn't have a particularly elitist schooling experience myself, but then had a sort of elitist Russell Group university, going and being a teacher and doing good. I had to learn what it actually meant to be as part of that community first, in order to be able to teach anybody properly. And it's not about the great and good descending into these contexts and helping out. It's much more sophisticated and complicated than that. So that's why this work is important. Keep it up.
Yes, no, absolutely. Thanks very much, Janet. I also just want to say, so I agree obviously with everything you're saying. It's what we're trying to accomplish here. But I also want to say that when we work with Bristol City Council, there are some unbelievably fabulous people in Bristol City Council who are, far more attuned to what's happened in the neighborhoods and different areas of Bristol than I am, or than many of us were on the project and stuff. So it's not, I don't want to kind of characterize them as completely out of touch. To the contrary, we learned loads from them, and they were always part of those sorts of conversations. Although there were also plenty of conversations we had with community organizations where they were frustrated by the local authority, frustrated by Bristol City Council in different sorts of ways. So, it's not to say that they're out of touch, but you're right, just trying to kind of capture the knowledge we have in local communities and make sure that that does find its way into policy interventions.
Okay, is there another question either in the room or on Zoom?
Would you mind to open the chat so we the conversation in Zoom room?
Oh gosh, yeah, 19 chat.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, a lot of it is
We go to another meeting now.
Yeah. Oh dear.
That's not what I was expecting.
Raise, why did you suggest?
Oh, here's one. Here's Marco. Yeah. So Marco, is he here still? Marco, do you want to say anything about this?
This is Marco in Loughborough.
Yeah, Marco Hampson.
Oh, sorry, you mean is he?
Yeah, sorry. Hi, John. Hi, everybody.
Wait, hold on. I can't hear you. Let me adjust the volume here. Can anyone hear him? Is he just coming out of my computer?
Yeah.
Can you say something, Marco?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we need to put the volume up a bit, I think, but we can hear you, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, John. It's nice to see you. Hi, Tariq. Hi, everybody. Yeah, it would be great to be in Bristol and celebrate with you the social, but alas, I'm here in Loughborough. Anyhow, very quickly, John, it's great, but as you could imagine, I do have some points that you can read them in the chat. It's partly also what Tariq mentioned before. Yeah, wishing the nation away is great as scholars. The nation stays there with the people. That's the first point that I mentioned. But also the fact that you present the nation in terms of national integration as a top-down somehow overlooks how much of that national integration is also done every day by the ordinary people. So there is a particular point there to take into consideration. And going forward, I would share with Tariq the idea that yeah, what about rethinking, reimagining the nation as a plural, multivocal, social, spatial, discursive register, rather than assuming that it's such a homogenizing register in which everybody's the same, which is indeed a fantasy, because it exists as a fantasy, it's not in the reality. So I think maybe going forward would be how the two can go together rather than excluding one. Either we go for the everyday integration and excluding the nation completely, or try to, and I'm sure you do this. So it's just, yeah, just.
Well, in the written version of the paper, Marco, did anyone hear that besides me?
Yeah.
All right, Chris. Well, I barely heard it either, but it doesn't matter. But Marco, in the written version of the paper, I cite this famous political geographer named Marco Antonsen, who talks about the relationship between the local and the national. And I think the point you make, the one that I kind of latched onto, was that the national is experienced to the local. So the work that you've done, so the national has a local kind of grounding to it. So our national imaginaries are also have a local dimension to it, and that's the stuff that you've done in Italy. And I agree with that. So again, I only made vague allusions to that in the talk where I talk about the different scales of experience, but that of course it can include the national. It's just not for me the starting point. And I think some of the stuff, if some of the more policy and political discourse surrounding integration does view it or does present it as an abstraction. So we talked about, fundamental British values. Who here knows what a fundamental British value is? Name one of them, right? I mean, these are, okay, what are they, Therese? Give us one.
They're not British.
Sorry?
They're not British.
All right. Yeah, good. So those are the things that I'm kind of, taking a swipe at. But of course. I mean, these things do manifest in people's everyday experiences, and we have to account for that. But I want to begin with the local to kind of think about that as a kind of gateway to that. So yeah, thanks, Marco.
Thank you, Marco.
Thanks, Tariq.
Like I'll make my second point now, because it does relate to the national, but it's a very different point to Marco. So given what you identify as social distance, you know, like lack of opportunities for, you know, access to the labor market, for instance, or access to certain kinds of housing and so on. It seems just totally unrealistic. Well, those are one kind of things. Also, there could be discrimination and racism, as you were saying a moment ago. It seems totally unrealistic to then say, oh, the solution has to be those things in your slide, which were all about people, you know, nodding and talking and feeding up local knowledge to the local authority, because the national may be exactly where the resources for solving those problems are, whether it's in terms of law or economic management, like new investments.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Hello?
why assume? I mean, this is in a way related
Yes,
to
please.
Dan's point about romanticizing the local. Why
Oh, hi,
assume
Nick.
that local problems can only be
Yes, of
solved
course.
by local resources when they may need a lot more? Because there's a lot of locals and they all have similar problems, and the national can either help to solve those problems.
Hello,
or
Anton, am I on speaker?
See, this is why,
Yeah. You need-
no, it's,
I don't know who it is, but you need to mute us. Oh, Chris.
excuse me.
Well done. So, well, that's my point, that
Yeah.
why cut yourself off from national resources when that's what may be needed?
So, so we don't, and you're up for that, for the reasons that you're describing. So we, the thing, if you had been at the launch, Tariq, where we launched the framework, you would see that we had this kind of integration. So I talked about these advocacy groups, you know, bringing different stakeholders together. And one of the thing that the advocacy groups were meant to focus on was this thing that we called, I think Therese devised it first, the integration worksheet, the idea of thinking through the different scales, so identifying the local problem, right? Because we can also identify national problems, and that's, you know, something we can consider as well. But there will be a local aspect to that national issue. But then, you know, who do we need? So what are the institutional or structural forces that are contributing to this problem that we need to address? And some of those may be local. It might be a, you know, transport company or whatever, or something like that. But some of them may be, you know, the Home Office or something like that. And so it's about working through that. And so if the Home Office needs to have a seat at the table to discuss this, then the Home Office needs to be there, right? So that has to be part of the conversation as well. Obviously, these things, I mean, we prioritize out of pragmatism alone the local. We're kind of working through things as best we can, because it's not always easy to get the Prime Minister to sit down with you when you're trying to work through a particular problem. But yes, part of the working through the problem is to identify both the scales, the neighborhood, local, national, supranational, possibly, although that doesn't really, that's no longer relevant in this country. But then also the different timelines of things, like, so what are the timescales of addressing this issue? Is this something that can be resolved quickly, or is it something that, you know, is going to, you know, require generations of investment or something like that? I don't know. So there are different ways of thinking through different aspects of that. But at that level, the national comes in not as a requirement, but as one of many possibilities. So there are local problems that should be, as you said, addressed nationally, and there are national problems that can be addressed locally. But, you know, it depends on the nature of the issue that we're talking about.
Then the conceptualization or the theorization that's doing the work is multi-scalar, not local.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah,
national.
didn't I say that? I
Well,
I don't know. I might not have said
it
that.
appeared on virtually every slide.
Yeah, so multi-scalar is, yeah, so low integration at the local that connects to other scales through the local, right? So it sort of prioritizes the local as a starting point, but not as an end point. And so it is multi-scale, absolutely. Yeah, it's designed as that. But it doesn't, but it's designed as that, but it's following from the bottom up everyday practice type thing that begins locally and then identifies the different scales from the local, rather than starting at the national and saying, oh, I wonder if this has a local dimension.
Yeah. Therese.
Yeah, it's kind of related to this point. So, I mean, there's lots of internal discussion in the project about the local and about, you know, the scope for action. activism at the local, particularly in conditions not of the making of local authorities or local groups. So I think one of the things that's kind of interesting about the sort of discussions that we had about the local, I mean, I really like Marco's point about the making of and remaking of national norms at the local level. I think one of the things that we were quite interested in there was the unmaking of national norms and and some of the implications of national discourse at the local level. Because on one hand, you might just have a kind of attitude which, or stance which is, I mean, there are certain things that are not made at local level, like citizenship regimes and the kind of legal ramifications of all of that. But there's something quite interesting about sort of thinking through the kind of sort of local perspectives on this, and thinking about how, what is the scope for local agency in a context where the citizenship regimes are deeply exclusionary. And that, I think, does sort of eke out or create space for a kind of range of different kinds of responses, because you could have quite a fatalistic response, which is this government is not going to tilt towards more inclusive citizenship regime because it's got quite polarized and binary accounts of what it means to be British. But that's not to say that there's nothing that can be done around the understanding of what it is to be a citizen at the local level. And that's where I think there's something quite interesting and important about what happens when you get local groups in dialogue about this. And you can see precedents for this in terms of like city of sanctuary kinds of discourses. And there are all kinds of ways where there's a a making and unmaking of citizenship at the local level, notwithstanding some of the kinds of very structural sort of implications of national regimes. And I think that also opens up the possibility that that when we talk about multiscalar, that it's not just simply like whether it goes cascades from top to bottom or pushes from bottom up to top, but there's also a local to local kind of aspect of all of this, which is the dialogues between cities around what is possible at the local to kind of remake or undo or think differently about some of those things, which I think was quite inspiring. To the extent where you can even have kind of quite sort of localized citizenship regimes that are about creating possibilities for refugees and migrants, for instance, to have very different kinds of experience of welcome and reception. But that can translate across a variety of domains. It need not be simply within the confines of immigration regimes. I think that's where the local kind of opens out spaces, which is not to say to disregard the power or the significance of the national. And I'm quite keen, as John knows, on featuring that in. But it's just thinking, where's the kind of scopes for possibility of rethinking some of this stuff.
Especially the fact that you directed all that at so yeah, what she said.
Well, it started off by saying, this kind of point of departure can be what Marco said about how, as it were, national integration, imagined national integration, identitarian integration can take place locally. But then the other things that you built on it prioritize the local in actually, I think, a very different way. Tell me if I'm misinterpreting you, Marco, but in a very different way to how Marco does it.
I'm acknowledging Marco's point, which is, and I guess the earlier discussions about not romanticizing the local. So I'm acknowledging that it's possible that they'll just reproduce.
Yes. Okay.
So I'm trying to signal that it's not a kind of romanticized version.
But just for other people too, and not everyone will know Marco's work, I'm sure, though I'm sure we should know more than we do. But one of the things that Marco's empirical work, which is based in Italy, brings out is how a lot of, African Italians and Chinese Italians and so on, when they see themselves excluded by certain local or regional, or for that matter, national people, as well, you're not really Italians and so on, they appeal to the national identity by insisting they're Italian in order to strengthen their local status where they're being excluded. So the local and the national really comes in, but here the national identitarian, but the national is the resource that is being used to lever status and insertion, national equality at a local level.
I was wondering about, because you mentioned economic barriers and national identity, but what about some of the things that can only start at the local level? So thinking about the spatial element of it, you know, the spatial elements of local communities that I've been aware of community groups advocating on behalf of certain schemes and things has been about, you know, where does violence happen at the local community and who's facing that violence, and where do we need increased lighting, or you know, what I don't know, where have the kind of local governments put in those homeless spikes that are, you know, just ruining everyone's day. I don't know how to conceptualize that, but some of the things that are more about how we practically move through the world have to start at the local, don't they? And I wonder if it, of course, all that stuff that you're talking about is really important, but by drawing on the examples that we already think of as being national issues, perhaps that slightly distracts from some of the bits that have to start in a much more a specific context.
To the solutions, you might define a problem at a national level. You know, eventually we may have a government that's interested in economic exclusion and addressing racism and all these sorts of things. But actually, you know, a lot of national policy may get devolved down to local, but also understanding what the problems are and the solutions at a local level. Some of the work we've been doing around sort of local responses to COVID, you know, the things that we needed to do here will not be the same as what needed to happen in other places. You know, the transport issues that exist in Bristol compared to, you know, where my mum and dad live down in Devon. You know, they need different solutions, which means adopting this sort of national picture as well, which I think was on what Rosie said.
I guess
Those opportunities that bring those together.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so I mean, you can obviously think of examples like that, Tariq, and I'm happy to go with that. But I want to start with Rose's examples rather than yours, or I guess from the national policy framework, I think the local is often an afterthought. It's sort of, you know, oh, I wonder if this is, you know, something we should be thinking about as well. I'm happy with the national being the afterthought and local being the priority. So starting with those local things, and sometimes, yeah, so sometimes the national policy is the problem at the local level, right? So sometimes that's the thing, that's the challenge, is dealing with kind of national level policy. So I just, you know, it's not to exclude the national, it's just not to prioritize it. And if we have to prioritize something, and we take this vague thing that Dan started with in the beginning, you know, we don't know, we haven't defined the local, but whatever, we're defining it as not the national. And so whether it's neighborhoods, whether it's whatever we're talking about, we're looking at those sorts of things, and then saying, okay, what do we need to do to address that? And very often the national will be implicated in that, but very often it won't. So anyhow, I'm not going to keep people from, I'm going to end this. You're not even, you're tearing up.
Well, I was just about to say, that's probably a happy place to begin. Sorry, I mean, to finish, because not only is there a kind of bridging synthesis in what you just said, but that synthesis reflects your own personal bias. So why don't we just give John our appreciation of his talk, and please do stay and have a drink, especially if you intend to go to the party later. This is a good time to begin. And thank you all who joined us on Zoom. I hope you'll join us next term as well. Sorry you're not here to join us for a drink, but perhaps in spirit you are. Bye-bye.
On.